Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. Frequently there's this question that comes in the Sacred Path of Love conference, and we've had it a number of times, and it's a very heavy question, and it addresses the issue of suicide. So usually I'll get a question along the lines of, what is the outcome? What is the outcome of someone who commits suicide in the Muslim community? Where does their soul go? Do they end up in hellfire? And what do we do about suicide in the Muslim community? How do we look at it? How do we address it? For the first part, we know that taking one's own life is considered a very serious sin in Islam, because you are in some ways taking the role that should be left to Allah. Allah is the giver of life and the giver of death. We are not the ones to decide how long or when we should leave this earth. That is up to Allah. And so prematurely ending your life is sort of an affront on those attributes of Allah, that He is the one that is in control. He is the one that decides how long we stay on the earth. And in some ways it may deprive others around us. If someone dies in that fashion, it may deprive the society of potential contributions that person could have made later in their life. But we would never know because the life was cut short. But that being said, do we know the actual outcome of where a soul will arrive in the hereafter? No, we don't know that. That is up to Allah. That is a decision by Allah. In my opinion, whenever Islam, has very powerful statements like that of, what is considered a sin or what is considered something just, a major violation, that is meant as a deterrent, and it's useful, because if I'm faced with a young person who is suicidal and they're telling me I really want to die or hurt myself, but the only thing that's stopping me is because I'm afraid of going to hellfire, then in that moment of crisis, I will say, fine, yeah, use that as a motivation. If you're stopping yourself from hurting yourself because you fear the outcome of your soul in the next life, then I encourage that. I think that's whatever we can do to stop someone from killing themselves in that moment of crisis, that's useful. But after the fact, after someone dies, I don't really see the use in going to a family member of someone who has committed suicide and telling that family member, hey, look, your loved one is now going to hell. I'm not sure what the point of that is at that point. There's enough hurt and loss already going on, and frankly, that's not a call for a human being to make. Where the soul ends up in the hereafter, that is solely under the decision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when we think about suicide and what is going on in the mind of a person who's suicidal, for many people, in most cases, there's a severe condition of depression. The symptoms of depression can be very, very powerful. And if they're not treated, then a person can end up in a state where their mind is not accurately looking at the world. So someone with a very depressive state or depressive state of mind has a very negative view of the world. They tend to view things very pessimistically. They tend to have these very overarching kind of statements about the world. For example, no one will ever love me. I'm never going to be able to succeed. These kind of statements that are almost a little bit exaggerations, because it's hard pressed to find someone who cannot succeed in anything in life. Usually there's some moments of success that a person had in their life, but they're just ignoring it at that moment, or they're unable to see the positive things around them. So they tend to look at life as a very bleak place that isn't really worth being in. And that's an error in the mind. And if it gets really severe, some people with really severe cases of depression, they can even have something like a psychosis, which is they're hallucinating, they're hearing voices, they're seeing things, they're paranoid about things. And so that's clearly a case where the cognitive faculties are being affected. And so when you're in a severe state of depression and your cognition is affected, in many ways, you are not your intellect is not intact at that moment. And when you talk to people who've tried to commit suicide but were stopped at the last second, or they were hospitalized, usually you find that the person, a sister shared the other day here at the Sacred Path of Love conference, she shared that when she was actually attempting suicide, it's not that she wanted to die at that moment, it was just that she could not find in her limited cognitive capacity at that moment any other path away from the pain. So we know that in those moments the mind is quite limited, and for some scholars of Islam, they would tell you if the intellect is not intact, then in that moment the person is not accountable to Allah. The pens have been lifted. You have to have a sane mind in order to be accountable to Allah. The angels will not record your deeds unless you're doing it from a standpoint of sanity, and that you know what you're doing and you made the decision consciously and with weighing the options and understanding. If you don't have that understanding, if you don't have your intellectual capacity, then it's very difficult to say that you're responsible at that moment. So the overwhelming majority of people that I've seen who are severely suicidal, they're not in their right minds. And so to kind of say, well, they're making this decision, they're going to go to hell, I'm not sure that's the case. In fact, I think they're probably excused in those moments because their sanity is not intact. Until you can stabilize their depressive symptoms and reduce the negative interpretations that they have of the world, then and get them stabilized, then in that state they're not really accountable, because they're acting in a way that, had they been sane, they would not have made that choice. So I think that's a useful way to think about it, because then you know what to address. We know that depression exists in our communities. We need to speak about it more, make it okay to talk about, so that we can maybe screen for it. We can do some detection and find who are maybe at risk for it and help those people, as opposed to letting them go on and on into a state where their depression is so severe that they might reach this level of thinking. So I pray Allah, allows our communities to find healing, to find strength.